I may have said this before, I don't remember. I've shared so many perspectives over the last 11 years preaching at the same congregation, but I have never been able to identify with people who have an attachment to a particular hometown or plot of ground or a particular place. And sometimes people jokingly refer to where they come from as God's country, as if somehow other places on the planet are not as much God's country. But the fact is, some people just don't do very well when they are outside their hometown or outside of their home state. They just spend their lives longing to go back to their place of origin. And that has always been very foreign to me. Now, of course, it's understandable if rather than the place, what people are really longing for are the people who reside in that place. But I've known of situations where the people who resided at a place were long gone, but the people from there still longed to go back to their place of origin, or to the place where they met their spouse, or the place where their values were formed, or the place where other milestones in life happened. I cannot relate. I seriously cannot relate because I've just never had that feeling of rootedness to any one particular place. I've always felt kind of like a sojourner upon the earth. And in some ways, I guess that's good, but I've never had that rootedness, and it could be because our family of origin kind of disintegrated with my mother's 2 divorces. The house that we grew up in is no longer standing, and our family never really owned any property of much value. And so again, I've always been kind of a sojourner upon the earth. I feel like wherever I'm at with my wife, that is home for however long I am there, and I've always been open to wherever the Lord wants to call me. I'm ready to go. But I've known people who just don't seem to function very well if they're not where they most prefer to be. They just don't quite feel as though they fit in. They're a fish out of water. They're a stranger in a strange land, and they're just almost determined that they're not going to be happy until they get back to the place they call home. And that was the case with some Israelites who had been removed from their homeland in Judah and taken into captivity in Babylon. The Babylonian army besieged Jerusalem, the capital of Judah, 3 times within the career of Jeremiah the prophet. And they exacted tribute. The Babylonians, they were actually a world power at the time. They were the empire. And they forced or demanded that all of the smaller, weaker nations around them paid tribute to them and served them as their vassals. And the Judean kings would do that for a time, but after a while they got tired of it. They wanted to be independent. They wanted to be an autonomous nation, and so they would rebel. So the first siege of Jerusalem by the Babylonians took place in 605 BC under the reign of Jehoiakim, and this was to get his attention, to remind him of who was really in charge. Captives were taken from among the nobility, along with some of the temple's treasures. Jehoiakim, however, was allowed to continue being king just so long as he remained subordinate to Babylon. Jehoiakim reigned until 598, when he again rebelled and was taken to Babylon in bronze shackles. His son Jehoiachin, also known as Jeconiah, was then installed as king of Judah. He lasted 3 months before Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, imposed a second siege upon Jerusalem. Jehoiachin was then led captive to Babylon along with his royal family. Most of the government and religious leaders were taken along with him, and all the military personnel, even the artisans, were taken captive. Anyone of power or influence was led to Babylon so that the Babylonians could be in charge of everyone residing in Jerusalem and in Judah. Because once you take away the shepherds, these people are going to be sheep, and the Babylonians can easily manipulate them. And so the Babylonians installed Jehoiachin's uncle Zedekiah as king of Judah, thinking that he might be more compliant. It was just after this second siege and captivity of 10,000 people that the prophet Jeremiah wrote a letter to those held captive in Babylon. Some messengers were going from Jerusalem to Babylon, delivering a letter from Zedekiah, the king of Judah, to the emperor Nebuchadnezzar. And it was very common for the vassals of the state to send regular reports to the emperor. And it's as if Jeremiah says to the people going that way, as long as you're going there delivering a letter from the king, deliver a letter for me while you're at it. Deliver this letter mainly to the surviving elders and the priests and the prophets among the people, basically the leaders of the exiles, so that they might influence them with this message. And the gist of the letter is basically that God wants the exiles to put down roots in Babylon. Not Jerusalem, but Babylon. They might be in a place they don't like and among people they don't like, but this is their new normal. This is their new reality. And so they just had to settle down, settle in to where they are, make themselves literally at home, because according to verse 10, the captivity is going to last for 70 years. That means that most of those taken captive now are not going to live to ever go home again. They're not going to see Jerusalem again, because suppose someone who is 20 years old is taken captive in this siege. By the time the captivity is over, they will be 90 years old. From 20 years to 90 years old, and by that time, they won't be up to making the 500-mile journey across desert sands to get back to Jerusalem. Their grandchildren might see Jerusalem, but they will never go home again. And so they must go about making a new home. And in verses 5 through 7, Jeremiah's advice, here it is, which God gives him to deliver. This is from the letter he wrote. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, don't decrease. Also seek peace and prosperity of the city in which I have carried you, or to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Eugene Peterson, in his book, Run with the Horses, wrote that at different times of our lives, we have all been exiled. The first exile is when we are exiled from the comfort and safety of the womb into a harsh and new, strange environment. And then eventually we're exiled from the home into the school setting, where we learn to function in an institutional kind of setting. And then we get comfortable with that and we're exiled from school. And we have to go into the workplace, the workforce. And in the workforce, we're in the workforce, we might get transferred to another town. We might go from rural to city. We might go from city to a rural community. We might feel like a fish out of water, like a stranger in a strange land. The landscape, language, climate, and mannerisms may all seem very unfamiliar, and we must become accustomed. And so it's an adjustment. And we may have moved to find a job, or maybe we were moved with our company or with the military. It may be short-term, it may be long-term. But the question is whether you go into this kicking and screaming, or whether you go into this from the get-go, not only willing to make the best of it, but ready to give it your best. Ready to do the best you can in the situation that you're in, to grow where you are planted. You know, we're told to live each day as if it were our last. Well, maybe we should live each day as if we're going to stay in the same place for the next 70 years. Because if you think you're going to leave just any time soon, then you're not going to be too invested in what you're doing or where you're at. But when we're in it for the long haul, or at least we live as though we are, then we're going to make the best of it. But if we go in thinking this is temporary, I can't wait until I get out of here, then we might be inclined to put things off, like purchasing a home or having a family, getting married, growing food. But Jeremiah writes to let the captives know that this isn't temporary. A false prophet named Hananiah in the previous chapter has told the people that it is temporary. He said that the captivity will last all of 2 years, and within that time all the stuff, all the gold and articles of the temple that have been taken are going to be returned. Hananiah was wrong. Because before this is over with, there's going to be a third siege of Jerusalem within the time of King Zedekiah, And with that one, Jerusalem is going to be demolished. The walls torn down, even the beloved temple will be leveled, and all of its treasures finally taken to Babylon. Only the poorest of people will be left to populate the ruins of Judah. So even with captives determined to go back home, in a short time, there won't be any home to go back to. So exile is going to last for a while. Jeremiah advises in verse 5 that the people build houses and settle down, plant gardens, and eat what they produce. Back in chapter 1, Jeremiah's prophecy was to be for the purpose of uprooting and tearing down, building and planting. And the exiles in Babylonian captivity, they had already experienced being uprooted. And soon their homeland was going to basically be torn down. But Jeremiah says, now that you're in captivity, begin a new life. You can't go back to the way things were, so it's time to build. It's time to plant again. You've experienced the uprooting and the tearing down. Now it's time to build and to plant. Build new houses. You're going to be here a while. Opt for the 30-year mortgage instead of the 15. Plant crops and learn the Babylonian methods of irrigation. Plant trees. You're going to be able to see them grow and then live under their shade. Learn the language. Find a new hairdresser. Unpack the boxes. Go ahead and get the Babylonian license plates for your chariot or your mule. Give it your best, because you're going to be here for a good long while. Jeremiah continues in verse 6, marry and have sons and daughters. Give your children in marriage. Some of life's milestones could be put off, shoved on the back burner. If you think you're only going to be there for a short time, if you think you're going to lose your job next week, you're not subconsciously too wrapped up in the company's growth. And if you expect to leave town or the country in a few years, then why invest yourself as a citizen? Why not wait until you get back home? And then you can encourage your kids to marry someone from the old country. But in a short time, Jeremiah says, that won't be possible. There won't be any old country to go back to. At least it won't be the same. So go ahead and raise your families here. Christians can, to some degree, relate to exile. Now, as Peterson writes, the exile to Babylon was, of course, more extreme and violent, but there is a sense in which Christians have always experienced exile because we have never really fit in, not completely, with a host culture. And God doesn't really want you to fit in completely with a host culture. What he's talking to the captives about is not assimilation, but he's talking about making the best of it, giving it their best, while remaining a distinctive people. In terms of Christians being exiles, I've always heard some couples say that they were not big on having children. They're like, why would we want to bring children? And these are Christians. They said, why would we want to bring children into this cruel and sinful world? Why would we want to do that? And my response to that is that if the righteous stop having children, then the world is just going to get crueler and more sinful, because there won't be any righteous people to offset those who are unrighteous. And that's no guarantee that your kids will turn out righteous, that they will keep the faith. But if they are raised in a Christian home, there's a better chance that they will. Christians should not opt to stop having children. I mean, the radical Islamists are multiplying like rabbits. It's a part of their plan for global jihad. So marry and have children, even while in exile. The Israelites were to increase in number and not decrease, just as the Hebrews did when they were captive or when they were living in Egypt. And in Exodus 1:9, Pharaoh says the Israelites have become much too numerous for us. Jeremiah 1:7 says, also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Whatever city or nation in which God's people find themselves, they are to seek the well-being of that place. They are to seek the well-being of that place. The word peace in Hebrew is the word shalom. It's a common Hebrew greeting. There is a thriving Jewish community in Memphis, Tennessee. and I used to work in a very upscale neighborhood populated by Jewish people. Most of them had a doormat that instead of saying welcome, it said shalom as I went door to door selling a service. But it said shalom, meaning peace. Not only peace or greetings, but well-being to the individual or to the group. We should pray for shalom in our city, in our state, in our country, in our world. We should not seek the failure of our political system or of any president, but instead we should wish them success in building and growing the economy and promoting justice for all. Israel was to pray for Babylon's success because that is where they lived. If the city prospers, you will experience some residuals. And so make the best of where you are. Put your best foot forward and serve the world around you. Build on the lot that you have been given. Grow where you are planted. Don't spend even a portion of your life longing and pining away for some other place. Some people are not too ready to invest themselves in their communities, their cities, even their churches. Things were so much better back home, we'll always hear them say. And so some hesitate to spend much time or effort making the world a better place. In terms of the world and even their own bodies, they've adopted a kind of Platonic dualism. They reason that since they're only here for a short time, the current material world, being destined to be laid bare by fire, why should we bother to invest much in it? So some spend their lives pining away for an afterlife, assuming this world is not going to last anyway, and it won't last forever, but it could last another 3,000 years. And what kind of world are we bequeathing to future generations? And what if we live longer than we expect? What if you expect that you're going to live to about 75, but you live to about 95? What have you done to enhance your quality of life so that you might serve God longer and more energetically? Christian discipleship is more than just an escape plan. It's more than just biding your time until you can leave this world. It's even more than just preparing others for the next age. But it's about investing your very best into this material world in which God has put you. And having encouraged his readers to give it their best, Jeremiah goes on in verses 8 and 9, addressing the false prophets who predict a short captivity. He says, don't let them deceive you. They may be invoking the name of God, but rest assured, he did not send them. They're basically telling the people what they want to hear. While Jeremiah preached, he certainly preached good news, but he preached a lot of bad news. He wasn't afraid to do that, because instead of telling the people what they wanted to hear, he was all about telling people what they needed to hear. They needed someone to tell them the truth. And so Jeremiah was a realist. The other prophets were false prophets, and telling people this optimistic message that wasn't true. It could line their pockets. It could give them a very secure living. As Walter Brueggemann in his commentary on Jeremiah states, the people weren't saved by either prophets of optimism or by voices of despair. What they needed was some middle ground between optimism and despair. What they needed was realism. They needed someone to tell them the truth. And until exiles got to the place of acceptance of their lot, acceptance of their new reality, they could not move forward. And until we accept our losses, until we come to the point of acceptance regarding the bad things that have happened to us, we're not going to be able to move forward either. We must come to grips with whatever our new normal happens to be, even if we hate it. Escapism is not an option, and despair is not productive. It isn't until acceptance that we can trust again that in spite of whatever bad has happened to us, we still have hope and a future. In Jeremiah 29, verses 11 through 13, he says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart." Now, some would say that this passage doesn't apply to us. They'll say it only applied to those exiles living in Babylon who were there for the long haul, 70 years of captivity. And despite this captivity, God remembered his promise to Abraham. He had remembered that Abraham's descendants had been promised the land, and they will return to it. Maybe not this generation, but the next, and they will prosper there. And prior to that, Israel can prosper in Babylon, and they will. But as with any scriptures, these verses were not written directly to us, but they nevertheless have application to us. They say, to say that these verses do not have application to us is basically to react too strongly against the so-called health and wealth gospel. You know, the people who believe that if you're a faithful Christian, a really faithful Christian, then life ought to go well for you. But not even the original readers of Jeremiah's letter should have expected that. I mean, they were in exile. Life was not perfectly peachy. But God still has a plan for them. And I happen to think, now this may rock your world. This may rock your world. This may shock you, but I happen to believe, are you ready? Now wait for it. I happen to believe that God intervenes in people's lives. I believe that God intervenes in people's lives, and we don't always know when he's intervening. Sometimes we take the credit for what God did. Sometimes we give God the credit for what we or someone else did. We don't always know, but we know that when he intervenes, it's always about promoting the best interests of his kingdom. It's not about us. We are not the center of the universe, but we are used to draw others toward the center of the universe, which is, of course, God. But if God has promised that believers all have hope and a future, then what about those who live the remainder of their days incarcerated for their faith? What about those who are in the wrong place at the wrong time and are victims of a drive-by shooting? What about those who contract some horrible illness? Well, we cannot see our hope and future only in terms of our personal well-being, because again, it's not all about us. We must see it in terms of our life's contribution to the kingdom of God. And God providentially uses the faithful to advance his kingdom, bringing his will to bear on this earth. And we can live for God's will, even in Babylon, even in exile, even in not the best of circumstances, even in a place we don't want to be, with people we don't want to be with. But we do have hope and a future. We are not promised toys and prizes in this life, but we do have hope and a future through God. Not even Israel existed for its own sake, but to be a light to the nations. And knowing of God's intervention, knowing how he can use us in putting his kingdom forward, that can lead to the most hopeful living that anyone can experience. To know that you're a part of this thing that is so much larger than yourself. And should our future on this planet be cut short by death, we still have hope and a future living eternally with God. Good will come even from exile, which tends to put things in perspective. As Peterson put it, in captivity, Israel learned that their previous lives were consumed by consumption, fashion, empty ritual, and insensitive exploitation, because normal life is full of distractions and irrelevancies. But it's often not until the superfluous is stripped away that we discover what is really essential. And that is what some have found in Babylonian captivity, and that's what some have found in this time of shutdown and pandemic. Only the essential survives. Do we really need professional sports? Do we really need to go to the movie theater? Do we really need to eat out? Only the essential survives. It took captivity for Israel to turn back to God, and he promised that if they would seek him with all their hearts, that he could be found. For those who seek God, God doesn't hide from them. He wants to be found. Jesus said, "Seek and you will find." And so if you're looking for God, look no farther than to Jesus Christ. For no one comes to the Father except through him, and he can give you hope and a future.